I think I got all the technical stuff figured out. Hey guys, it's been a while. Question mark here. Last night, Steve, well, not last night, a couple of days ago, Steve sent me this article talking about evaluative statements in antinatalism, and I wanted to cover it and go over some of the sources in the paper or the article. I'm a little bit sleep deprived, so please bear with me. I also wanted to just get the live stream working again. For anybody new to the channel, this channel is about reviewing and interviewing academic philosophers and academic philosophy. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. And again, I don't really have a set thing here. I just really wanted to test out my setup to make sure everything's working okay. I actually don't know if people can hear me, so I'm going to check the video after. If this video is not doesn't capture correctly, I'll just delete it and try again, or I'll upload it as a recording. So anyways, let's get right into it, because this has come up in some of the Facebook groups and Discord. Well, it's been talked about forever since I've been involved, and let's take a look. So let's see here, one sec. I'm still figuring this out. Okay. The Error of Evaluative Statements in Antinatalism by Steve Godfrey. So he posted this October 30th. So let's see here. My reason for writing this is to see if I can turn some scrappy thoughts I've been ruminating on into something intelligible. It stems from the debate within antinatalist circles about whether or not antinatalism includes animals. You know what? I have my chat open and it's kind of distracting, so I'm just going to turn that off so I can focus on the paper here. It stems from the debate within the antinatalism circles about whether or not antinatalism includes animals. The crux of my thinking is concerned with antinatalists erroneously asserting proprietary type claims over evaluative assessments about existence. The most obvious example being Benatar's claim that coming into existence is always a serious harm. Most antinatalists, understandably, assume that's an antinatalist statement, but I've always had nagging doubts about categorizing such statements as uniquely antinatalist. They read more like stock standard pessimism to me. I can understand that. I'll try to make my thinking clear by referencing two videos arguing in favor of animals being included in antinatalism, posted by Tejas Gokhail, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name wrong, Tejas, and Lawrence Anton. I'll be checking out those videos in this live stream. Hopefully it works. Both videos tackle the issue by presuming to divide... I'm going to check... Is my microphone? Yeah, it's on. Both videos tackle the issue by presuming to divide antinatalism into two separate parts, which Anton mistakenly labels evaluative and normative. Let's see why he's wrong. Anton's justification for the division is based on Met's statement, contemporary antinatalism is fascinating and important for requiring sophisticated reflection on the evaluative question of how to judge the worthwhileness of lives, and on the normative one of what basic duties entail from the creation of new lives. All right. However, Lawrence Anton misconstrues Metz. Metz isn't saying antinatalism consists of two parts. He's making the point that normative antinatalist conclusions are derived from non-antinatalist principles. What he says on P2 of the same paper, contemporary antinatalists aim to show that the balance of what is currently deemed moral common sense among professional philosophers goes in their favor. They claim to be teasing out the unexpected antinatal implications of principles that are widely held by academic ethicists. labels evaluative and normative. Probably should watch the video beforehand. I'm not too sure. The evaluative statements are assessments of the worthwhileness of lives from which normative statements can be derived. Gokale, evaluative, coming into existence is bad, and the normative, bringing someone into existence is morally wrong. Anton, the evaluative, is coming into a human existence is a serious harm, and the normative is it's unethical to create sentient or human life. Okay. The arguments for including animals are predicated on the evaluative statements. On the basis, such assessments don't require moral agents, as the normative statements do. And because the focus is on the beings coming into existence rather than beings bringing others into existence. I don't know why it wouldn't require moral agents for it to be a moral statement. I think it could be a value statement. Basically stated, the argument is, since the evaluative statements are antinatalist type statements, they apply to animals. Animals are therefore included in antinatalism. Put another way, P1 coming into existence is always a serious harm for animals as well as humans. P2 coming into existence is always a serious harm in an antinatalist type statement. Is an antinatalist type statement. Conclusion, animals are included in antinatalism. I contend this approach only succeeds if the evaluative statements are uniquely antinatalist, begging the question, what do I mean by uniquely antinatalist evaluative statements? I define a uniquely antinatalist evaluative statements as a statement which is used to derive antinatalist normative statements and which can't be used to derive non-antinatalist normative statements. Let me read that. I define a uniquely antinatalist evaluative statement as a statement which is used to derive antinatalist normative statements and which can't be used to derive non-antinatalist normative statements. Truth be told, I suspect this is an empty set. The easiest way to illustrate what I mean is to show evaluations which can be used to derive both antinatalist and non-antinatalist normative statements. Example, life is suffering. The world is malignantly useless potato mashing network. They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. Life is so terrible, it would have been better not to have been born. Who is so lucky? Not one in 100,000. The optimist proclaims that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist fears this is true. To bear children into the world is like carrying wood to a burning house. These statements can be used to derive antinatalist type conclusions, but they aren't uniquely antinatalist, and therefore neither define nor encapsulate antinatalism in any sense. So I'm just gonna quickly read this over, and then I'll give some thoughts because it'll take a while if I stop at each section. Let's consider three variations of Benatar's evaluation. Antinatalists typically regard as uniquely antinatalist on the basis they are presented in the context of antinatalism discourse. 1, coming into existence is always a serious harm. 2, coming into a human existence is a serious harm. 3, coming into existence is bad. Okay. I contend these evaluations are the same type of the above listed examples. They can be used to derive antinatalist normative statements, but they aren't uniquely antinatalist because they can be used to derive non-antinatalist normative statements. A hedonist could use the statements to argue in favor of a duty to increase the pleasures of life to offset the harms of coming into existence. An ethicist would use them to justify the obligation to end sentient suffering by annihilating all sentient beings. Although not normative, a Buddhist could use them to justify acceptance of the Four Noble Truths. As the statement can be used to derive non-antinatalist normative and other types of conclusions, it's an error to say they define or encapsulate antinatalism, or that antinatalism has some kind of proprietary claim to them. I think these statements are more correctly categorized as pessimistic evaluations. Hedonism, Ephilism, and Buddhism have just as much claim to the statements as antinatalism. It's therefore an error to represent them as antinatalist type statements and rely on them to say animals are included in antinatalism. Zooming out, away from animals to antinatalism to broader considerations, Metz makes the point that contemporary antinatalists aim to show that the balance of what is currently deemed moral common sense among professional philosophers goes in their favor. They claim to be teasing out the unexpected antinatal implications of principles that are widely held by academic ethicists. Metz is making the point that normative antinatalist conclusions are derived from non-antinatalist principles. In other words, the premises underlying antinatalist normative conclusions aren't antinatalist. Only the normative conclusions can be categorized as antinatalist and as defining antinatalism. Take, for example, my syllogism for the consent argument. I derive a normative antinatalist conclusion from non-antinatalist statements of fact P1, P2, and P4, and a common sense non-antinatalist principle widely held by academic ethicists, P3. Premise 1. Dukkha is an inevitable consequence of being brought into existence. P2. Humans exist absence, purpose, subspecies, aeternitatis. P3. It's unethical to non-consensually expose people to inevitable dukkha, absent a purpose beyond the dukkha itself, PSSA in this case. It's in P4. It's impossible to get consent from before bringing someone into existence. Conclusion. It's unethical to bring people into existence because it non-consensually exposes them to the inevitability of dukkha, absent purpose, subspecies, aeternitatis. The conclusion is a normative antinatalist statement, but the premises can't be categorized as antinatalist type statements. Conclusion. If my analysis is right, it voids every argument relying on such evaluative statements to claim animals are included in antinatalism. This doesn't mean antinatalism aren't included in antinatalism. Sorry, this doesn't mean animals aren't included in antinatalism. It only means these particular arguments fail. And for what I've seen, every argument in favor of animals being included in antinatalism relies on categorizing these kinds of evaluative statements as antinatalist. So some of my thoughts on this, I think there's a lot of mix-up of or like miscommunication between everybody that's making these claims, and I haven't seen the videos yet, so this is just like my thoughts right now, because I think I've in the past maybe I don't know in the past 2 years on the podcast I may have misspoke about, first of all, like, what are we defining antinatalism to begin with? Is it the conclusion of an argument, or are we making an assessment of the nature of reality? And I think that's a divide. I think some people are saying that in a normative sense, in terms of the value of a statement, that this is bad, that this outcome or this action is bad, and it's not giving an argument. It's just making a normative statement, and I think that making those statements is a normative statement. So, for example, like you can have normative statements on aesthetics, or like this painting is beautiful. You can have epistemic normative claims about what is good, and then you can make moral normative claims, and you could make prudential claims. I think when it comes to normativity, there might be some discussion there where people are talking about different things. And then also, of course, like, how are we defining antinatalism? Because if they're making the claim that antinatalism is just an assessment about procreation, and I think this is what would differentiate it from philosophical pessimism, is, I mean, it's philosophical pessimism is quite broad, but the from what I remember from the literature, it's just saying how making ontological and metaphysical claims about reality in a pessimistic light. But this is honing in on a particular aspect of existence, creating new sentient life. And the antinatalist is making the normative statement, or some antinatalists are making the normative statement of, this is a harm, this is bad. Which is different than saying, this is wrong and because, and then giving an argument, a moral argument with an antinatalist conclusion. So that's just like, on the face of it, like how I'm thinking about this. I'm a little noisy and there's a barking dog, so I might get sidetracked here thinking about this. So yeah, I think there's a couple of things that need properly defining. Is antinatalism a conclusion of an argument about morality, or is it just a descriptor? Is it a description, or is it a normative statement from descriptive statements? And I think that's what Benatar was doing in his book by making a normative statement of this is a harm with his axiological asymmetry argument. And he was saying that the asymmetry, again, I need to look for the quote or the footnote where he said it was including animals. But I think he was saying that his argument was including animals. That doesn't necessarily mean that that all antinatalist conclusions include animals. It's just that his particular argument, which not all we all know this, not all antinatalists agree with the asymmetry. So if you reject the asymmetry, then for those that hold that position, you don't have to include animals in that case. Now, this is someone, I'm saying that as someone who does include animals. However, now that I'm thinking about it, I think I got to be very, very careful when I say that statement now. Because there was a talk about moral agency, and that is where I probably would differ from other sentiocentric antinatalists, if we're going to use that terminology. So for me, I'm making the moral claim. Like, this is my view. I would say the moral claim is that it is morally wrong to bring new sentient life into existence if you're a moral agent. I don't think that an evaluation of moral rightness or wrongness can be had without a moral agent. Ought implies can, usually. And, I mean, if you can't do otherwise, then I don't, determinism aside, then, like, if you can't make these, if a person is incapable of making moral evaluations and moral choices, then I wouldn't be able to say that this person is, like, I don't think moral subjects are accountable for not making choices if they're incapable of making choices or making evaluations of morality. I think that's the responsibility of moral agents. So if the claim is that agency isn't required, then that's where I would differ. And then that would complicate things further, because that would mean that under sentiocentric antinatalism, there would be a split between those that are saying that a moral agent needs to be making the choice for it to be for a conclusion of anti. I wouldn't know how someone saying you wouldn't need that if you wouldn't need moral agency and then say it's wrong. The only way I think that you can save that is just, again, saying it's a normative statement that this is a harm, that this is bad. But again, it doesn't say that it's wrong. It's a value statement. That's not my argument, and so it's a little bit hard for me to wrap my head around. But let me just see if there's anything else I can comment in this article before we take a look at some of the videos. But I've always had a nagging doubt. So both videos tackle the issues by presuming to divide antinatalism into two separate parts. The evaluative and normative. I would say descriptive, at least in the literature that I've read. I like the idea of evaluative, it has the word value in there. So it's but that actually mixes things up. The descriptive isn't making a value statement. It's the normative making a value statement, or it can be making a value statement. Moral claims are all normative, but not all normative claims are moral statements. Anyway, so I would probably change that up a bit in the discourse. But again, I am kind of going in here blind, not knowing what their arguments are. The arguments for including animals are predicated on the evaluative statements. So the contention is, I contend this approach only succeeds if the evaluative statements are uniquely antinatalist. And I sent Steve a message about this, and I'm trying to find the section where it is. These statements can be used to derive antinatalist type conclusions, but they aren't uniquely antinatalist. And okay, so here it is. I contend these evaluations are the same type. They can be used to derive antinatalist normative statements, but they aren't uniquely antinatalist because they can be used to derive non-antinatalist normative statements. I think this will be another divide too. So, I mean, he later on says a hedonist and an ethicist can come to different conclusions because of these statements. And I think that's exactly why there's such a division within antinatalist circles, is because, if you hold the position that these are antinatalist normative statements, you can derive non-antinatalist normative conclusions. And again, you're putting here non-antinatalist normative statements, and I think moral, a moral argument has a moral claim within the premise, within one of the premises. Again, I think the structure of this is a little bit all over the place. So anyway, I would say that if what I think they're going to argue is that, because I mean, I've seen people say that in certain cases you can procreate for some utilitarian outcome, but make an antinatalist assessment about procreation or coming into existence, at least. If the person says that my belief is that coming into existence is a harm, and I'm pretty sure Benatar says this in his book too, that again, if someone says that's antinatalism, that it's just the statement that coming into existence is a harm, that's it. And from there, I'm going to argue for all sorts of other belief systems. I mean, it's exactly what's happening in the antinatalist circles. So I mean, people are doing that. Now, are they right to be doing that? I don't know, because I think people are using normative statements differently than what I think they're using it for, and I think moral arguments, like I think people are making descriptive statements, they're making normative statements, and they're making moral arguments, or they're making moral claims, and I think that kind of confuses things. And then some people are making metaphysical and ontological claims. So you got a lot of claims, and figuring out what's antinatalism and what isn't, I think, is tricky without a common definition that we're all working with. Because on the face of it, it's obvious to me that I would agree with you, Steve. Right here, let's see. They can be used to derive antinatalist normative statements, but they aren't uniquely antinatalist because they can be used to derive non-antinatalist normative statements. That, on the face of it, that sounds correct, but I don't think it's shown why that would be the case. So what if, like, antinatalist normative statements can end up with well, again, we're saying normative statements as like it's a conclusion or something like that. So I'm so if these are claims, coming into existence is bad, and that's an anti-nihilist normative statement, but they can be used to derive non-anti-nihilist normative statements. This is where I feel like these are two different things. Then, like, I think when you make an argument in favor of procreation or the creation of new sentient life, I in my view, I would say that that's not anti-natalist. But again, if the definition is we're not making the conclusion that it's wrong, or some people are, or some parts of the anti-natalist circles are saying we're not making anti-natalist moral arguments. We're just giving a value statement about the nature of coming into existence. If that's what it is, if that's narrowed it down, then, well, I mean, I can't really argue that if that's what they're claiming. But I think that would have to be that would have to be specified very clearly whenever someone's making an argument or putting forth like their position of what they define antinatalism to be. And this is why I like this discussion, because it's making me reflect upon what I say to people. Because whenever people ask me what is antinatalism, I just say both. I just say some people make the claim that is just that creating a new sentient, either human or non-human animal, creating a sentient being is a harm to that being, or it's making the more positive claim that it's a moral wrong, and then that would be that would have to be argued for that conclusion. And of course, there's like multiple ways to argue for that. So that's usually how I communicate it. What's my view? I'm going down the moral claim. I'm saying it's a moral wrong to create new sentient life into existence. And I make a distinction there I use the word creation and creation ethics, because I believe it's wrong in reference to a moral agent enacting this. So if two animals are in the wild and they're doing their thing, I'm not going to say that those moral subjects are wrong. What I'm saying is, if a moral agent purposefully chooses to create new sentient life, then that is the wrong action. And so that's my view on that. All right. So I think that's all my thoughts for now. I might have further thoughts later on. Again, I'm just trying to test out the video, the streaming, and yeah, it's been like almost a year since I've streamed or made any content, so I'm very rusty. I actually am a little bit hazy on some of the arguments, so yeah, please bear with me. And you know, even talking right now is just I'm not as smooth as I used to be, just because it's been so long. So anyway, let's take a look at the videos. We'll start with Tejas first.
Alright, does antinatalism apply to other animals? Does it apply to animals bred by humans for consumption and companionship? Does it apply to animals not bred by humans? This is a very polarizing question even among those who identify themselves as antinatalists. There are many disagreements on this subject, and underlying to those disagreements are two different views of antinatalism. In this video, we'll look at those two different views, the underlying arguments of those views, and then see where it leads us further. One clarification though, we are not talking about environmental antinatalism, which is the idea that resources consumed by humans are causing a lot of environmental problems like climate change, and one of the best ways to reduce their impact on climate would be to not add another human being, another human consumer onto this planet. This reason to oppose procreation is very human-centric, because if tomorrow all the environmental problems are solved, there would be no reason for this view to exist. Ethical antinatalism, on the other hand, is based on harms and suffering of sentient life itself. And to whom all this ethical antinatalism applies is today's question. Now, I'm not talking about eugenics here, which is the idea that only certain groups of humans should or should not procreate based on certain arbitrary factors like race, religion, and so on. We start with a position that antinatalism includes all human beings, which is the members of the species Homo sapiens. The question then is, can it be extended beyond our species to other animals? The two views of antinatalism which is causing this debate are, one is that bringing someone into existence is morally wrong, and the other one is that coming into existence is bad. Now, by existence, I mean sentient existence, which is the existence with capacity to suffer.
So far, I agree with him. It's kind of what I was trying to get at. He's just saying it better. So yeah, so far, he's right about what's happening.
So, on the first view of bringing someone into existence being morally wrong, the focus is on those who are doing the act of procreation. We are saying that parents are doing something morally wrong. This assumes that parents have a capacity to decide between right and wrong. This capacity to decide between right and wrong is called moral agency, and those who have it are called moral agents. And so the argument goes that because other animals cannot make these decisions between right and wrong, they don't have this moral agency. Antinatalism cannot include other animals. It can only be applied to human beings. But
so that kind of sounds like my argument or my position. I think that there's a caveat there, because a way to think about this is, instead of saying non-human animals or saying animals and humans, if we just say we're all animals, right? The way that I would probably reframe this conversation is just, we already know that people that are on the position of animals, animal ethics, or no, I probably shouldn't use that. Okay, I guess the only way that I can say is using the V word. If you're taking the vegan position or actually this might be better. If you're taking the anti-speciesist position, which I would take, then the ethical issue is about creating persons. So the anti-speciesist position is saying that you shouldn't discriminate based on species membership for personhood status and moral consideration of persons. So philosophically, we just say, just wipe out the idea of dividing, humans and animals, we're all animals. What the argument is saying that some animals are sentient to the extent that they are deserving of moral consideration and personhood status. And so my position is, if you're a moral agent, you shouldn't create new sentient persons. And so in that definition, or in that argument, in that statement, that would include non-human animals, because I'm arguing, or some people are arguing, that they are worthy of moral consideration and are persons. So if that's true, then it follows that it would be morally wrong, or I can say that it would include animals, and not just human centric. But again, that's on the foundation that you're agreeing with the idea that non-human sentient animals are persons, and then all this other stuff follows. I'm just gonna rewind it just a bit in case I just rambled on for nothing and he just said the same thing.
Alright, does antinatalism apply to other animals? Does it apply to animals bred by humans for consumption and companionship? Does it apply to animals not bred by humans? This is a very polarizing question, even among those who identify themselves as antinatalists. There are many disagreements on this subject, and underlying to those disagreements are two different views of antinatalism. In this video, we'll look at those two different views, the underlying arguments of those views, and then see where it leads us further. One clarification though, we are not talking about environmental antinatalism, which is the idea that resources consumed by humans are causing a lot of environmental problems like climate change, and one of the best ways to reduce their impact on climate would be to not add another human being, another human consumer onto this planet. This reason to oppose procreation is very human-centric, because if tomorrow all the environmental problems are solved, there would be no reason for this view to exist. Ethical antinatalism, on the other hand, is based on harms and suffering of sentient life itself. And to whom all this ethical antinatalism applies is today's question. Now, I'm not talking about eugenics here, which is the idea that only certain groups of humans should or should not procreate based on certain arbitrary factors like race, religion, and so on. We start with the position that antinatalism includes all human beings, which is the members of the species Homo sapiens. The question then is, can it be extended beyond our species to other animals? The two views of antinatalism which is causing this debate are, one is that bringing someone into existence is morally wrong, and the other one is that coming into existence is bad. Now, by existence, I mean sentient existence, which is the existence with capacity to suffer. So, on the first view of bringing someone into existence being morally wrong, the focus is on those who are doing the act of procreation. We are saying that parents are doing something morally wrong. This assumes that parents have a capacity to decide between right.
This might be a little bit of a nitpick, but I noticed he used the word parents, and you don't, again, how do we define parent? I think you can be a person who adopts and still be considered a parent. So again, I think I'm nitpicking here for like what his overall argument, or what he's claiming. But if Tejas, if you see this, I would probably reword that, unless you disagree with me. But to be a parent doesn't necessarily mean that you're procreating. You can adopt and be considered a parent. So I'm just, anyway. It's,
wrong. This capacity to decide between right and wrong is called moral agency, and those who have it are called moral agents. And so the argument goes that because other animals cannot make these decisions between right and wrong, they don't have this moral agency. Antinatalism cannot include other animals. It can only be applied to human beings. But what about a couple who cannot understand the concept of morality but can still reproduce sexually? Would we exclude such people from antinatalism? Many people in poor countries, or those who are dominated by extreme religious beliefs, don't usually have access to independent thinking. Even in many cases, many mentally healthy people, mentally healthy parents, are influenced by social norms, religious beliefs, restricted education, and poverty. So even though they have capacity to think or to decide between right and wrong, they cannot use that capacity effectively. Would we have to exclude such people from antinatalism? What about poor people in richer nations? What about accidental pregnancies? What about teenage pregnancies? And how far down the slippery slope can we go? Or to go to another extreme of the spectrum altogether, should we then say that antinatalism can only include the people who have all the resources in the world to make accurate moral decisions? To solve this problem, we need to look at why bringing somebody into existence is morally wrong in the first place. That brings us on to the underlying arguments for antinatalism. Now, typically, they are philanthropic and misanthropic arguments. They are very elaborate arguments. I'll try and put some links in the description explaining the details of these arguments. But on a very high level, philanthropic arguments are those which are concerned about suffering of the being who is coming into existence. So, for example, Bennett's asymmetry compares the presence of harms and benefits of those who already exist to the absence of harms and benefits of those who don't exist but will be coming into existence. Similarly, optimism bias talks about our cognitive bias towards positive past experiences once we have come into existence. Risk argument talks about risks of life once we are here. Consent argument talks about impossibility of obtaining consent before we have come into existence. Misanthropic argument talk about the harms done by us to others once we have come into existence. So you see, all the underlying arguments of antinatalism actually focus on coming into existence. Even Bennett's book is called Better Never to Have Been and not Better Never to Bring Someone into Existence. That brings us on.
I wouldn't judge a paper or a book just on its title. I mean, he does make both claims in that book. Anyway.
On to the second view, that coming into existence is bad. This view does not need a moral agent. But this does not care if parents had a moral agency, whether they were able to really decide between right and wrong. Coming into existence being bad in and of itself is enough to include all human beings into antinatalism. But then we are on.
So, yeah, I guess this depends on how are you defining antinatalism. Is it a value statement of creating into existence, or a moral claim? And I don't know what to say about that, because like there's obviously two sections of the anti-nihilist world that are doing two different things. So, I mean, that's just a statement. That's a descriptive statement right there. That's what's happening. Well, all right.
Another slippery slope here. Why to apply only to human beings? Why to draw the line on the level of the species Homo sapiens? Why can we not say that coming into existence is bad for all sentient beings? That is, anybody who can suffer, including other animals, including the animals bred by humans, as well as animals not bred by humans. Can we then say that antinatalism can include all other animals? Well, we need to evaluate if the underlying arguments for antinatalism also apply to other animals. Now, one word of caution, the actual titles of the arguments themselves, which are philanthropic and misanthropic, come from a root called anthropo, which in Greek means man or human. So the titles or names of the arguments are human-centric, but they can still be evaluated independently of what they're called. So in philanthropic argument, Bennett's asymmetry, I think very readily and severely applies to other animals. Animals which are bred in factory farms or for slaughterhouses definitely suffer extensively and before eventual slaughter by humans. That suffering would not have occurred to them had they not come into existence. Similarly, animals which are born into wild without any human assistance go through all kinds of sufferings. There are websites dedicated just for wild animal suffering, and I'll put some links in the description for them. But the point is, they do suffer. That suffering would not have occurred to them had they not also not come into existence. One point to note is that Bennett's asymmetry is a person affecting view. What that means is that it is not a impersonal view that, if there is some space where no suffering exists, that's good. It says that absence of suffering is good from the perspective of the being who is going to save from that suffering. So those who draw the line between animals who are bred by humans and animals who are not bred by humans and try and apply antinatalism only to one category need to look at this example. Let's take an example of a buffalo whose throat is being slit by humans in a slaughterhouse, and compare that to another buffalo who is being eaten alive by lions. Now, point taken that there are differences here. Lions are doing it out of compulsion. They don't have any other option for their survival. Humans can have different choices, especially modern humans. So if they're doing it, even then it's unnecessary suffering. So there are differences. But from the perspective of buffalo, right? Does it matter whether she's being eaten alive by lions or whether she's being slaughtered by humans? She still suffers. And suffering is what matters to her. Correct? So from her perspective, it would have been better if she had not come into existence, so that she would have been saved from that suffering. And so for that reason, I don't see a reason to make this distinction between animals which are bred by humans and not bred by humans when talking about including them into antinatalism, especially when we're talking.
I can think of something. And I think this is where I'm going to agree, and I think this is where Steve is coming from, because with that statement, then you can justify anything to prevent or from happening, and you can get arguments and conclusions in favor of procreation and deleting animals, which is a dangerous slippery slope in my opinion. So I mean, if you can justify it, so be it. Like, you can present an argument, but if I just say that it's bad for, like, a person affecting view of it's bad for the animal, and then that's antinatalism, and that antinatalism includes human and animals, and like, if that's all it is, then you can figure out ways of arguing for, again, non-antinatalist positions of, well, if it reduces numbers to allow humans to procreate, to take over a certain amount of land and use a bunch of resources so there's less wild animals, then go ahead and procreate, and which is not antinatalist and would be very confusing and I think this goes back to the in terms of those arguments. I'm not going to go down the whole debate about normative ethics because I do that too much, but I think I would have a problem with defining it this way because it opens the door for other non-antinatalist conclusions. So I would be wary of that.
Bennett's asymmetry here. Correct? So from her perspective, it would have been better if she had not come into existence, so that she would have been saved from that suffering. And so for that reason, I don't see a reason to make this distinction between animals which are bred by humans and not bred by humans when talking about including them into antinatalism, especially when we're talking Bennett's asymmetry here. Optimism bias.
So that's I don't know how careful I've been in the past about communicating this, but I try to say that when people include animals, at least in the Benatar's argument for antinatalism, the asymmetry would include animals. But that's just saying that the asymmetry includes animals. It's not necessarily saying antinatalism includes animals. It's just saying that the asymmetry. So you're just saying that this particular argument includes animals. And then you got to go further to say that the conclusion includes animals. Especially if people reject the argument, the asymmetry argument. I might have to think about that some more, because that's the way I've been trying to frame it, at least conceptually in my mind, is that when we're talking about a whole bunch of arguments for antinatalism, obviously we all don't agree on one particular one. We all there's so many. Different types of people are making different types of arguments for the same conclusion or getting there a different way. And so what I would say is that, well, this particular argument is including animals, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the other arguments include animals. So a case could be made that, well, those arguments don't include animals. And with those arguments, then an Anton's conclusion would be human-centric. And I mean, they would be justified in that if they if it's not included. You'd have to figure out what their argument is, and then see if you can position moral subjects and persons into that argument. Anyway,
Which is a little tricky one. At the time, I don't see a reason to make this distinction between animals which are bred by humans and not bred by humans when talking about including them into antinatalism, especially when we're talking Benatar's asymmetry here. Optimism bias is a little tricky one. At the time of making this video, I could not find any study which proved or disproved existence of optimism bias in animals which were not trained for any specific behavior. But risk argument definitely applies to animals. Animals in slaughterhouses and factory farms at risks of different kinds of suffering before eventual slaughter by humans. Animals in wild are at risk of predation, starvation, disease, parasitism, sexual coercion, competition for resources, you name it. Like a whole documentary can be made just on risks faced by animals in the wild. So it definitely applies to other animals. Consent is a human concept, but I think the fact still remains that none of the animals ever to have been born on this planet ever would have consented before being born, because that's just impossible. So consent argument applies to other animals. Misanthropic argument could apply to other animals only to a limited extent. You can say that existence of a lion or the fact of coming into existence of a lion is bad for all the zebras that lion is going to kill in their lifetime. Similarly, coming into existence of a new zebra can be said to be bad for all other existing zebras because it adds to the competition for already existing zebras for resources. So misanthropic argument applies to a limited extent to other animals. So you see, of the 5 underlying arguments for antinatalism, at least 4 apply to other animals. So that indicates to me that we can include other animals within the scope of antinatalism. But we must also think about other actions which we think as morally wrong in human world and don't necessarily apply to others.
for the record, I don't know if that's correct or not. Like, I know that some of the arguments talk about procreative duties, and that's going to require moral agency, and I'd have to look into the actual details of the arguments, whether or not I would agree with that or not. But right now, I don't remember them off the top of my head. But I would say that at least the ones that argue about procreative duties, then I think that requires moral agency, at least.
Let's take an example of theft. Now, we have a view that stealing is morally wrong, but we don't apply it to other animals, even though theft is very common in other animals. So when we see a bunch of hyenas stealing prey from hunted lions, we try and justify it, saying that that's just nature, that's just how nature works. Now, whether that justification is enough or not is a different matter. But the fact that we're trying to justify it indicates that we think that stealing is bad. So we can merge these two views and say that stealing is morally wrong because stealing is bad, because stealing causes harm to the one being stolen from, whether or not a moral agent exists or not. Similarly, we can merge two views of antinatalism and say that bringing someone into existence is morally wrong.
I think there would be a distinction between saying it's bad and then saying it's wrong. So you could say that it's bad for the person, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's morally wrong. I'd have to think about that some more, but that's just my intuition right now.
Because coming into existence is bad, because coming into existence causes harm to the one who is come into existence, whether or not there was a moral agent involved or not. And so for that reason, I don't think there is any other term or label needed to include all sentient beings into antinatalism. Just antinatalism is enough. Alright, does antinatalism apply? Even then, it's unnecessary suffering for already existing zebras for resources. So misanthropic argument applies, especially when we're talking Bennett's asymmetry here. Optimism bias is a little tricky one, so not come into existence. One point to note is that Bennett's asymmetry is a person-affecting view. What that means is that it is not a impersonal
the video
view.
Just cut out, and I forgot where we left off.
Philanthropic and misanthropic come from a root called anthropo, which in Greek is a little tricky one. At the time of making this video, I could not find any study which proved animals. So that indicates to me that we can include other animals within the scope of antinatalism. But we must also think about other actions which we think as morally wrong in human world and don't necessarily apply to other animals. Let's take an example of theft. Now, we have a view that stealing is not label needed to include all sentient beings into antinatalism. Just antinatalism is enough.
Oh, does it just cut off like that? Oh, okay, so I guess that is the whole video. One sec. Maybe the version I had was... Oh, okay. Alright, so that was the whole video. Okie dokie. Let's, I don't have any further thoughts on that. Again, it's making that distinction between like saying something's wrong and then saying something's bad, or saying something's, like making the moral argument, versus the normative statement that this is bad for the individual. Because you can say something's bad for someone, but then you need further argumentation to say that it's wrong. So I don't know. I guess like that's where it is. I disagree about the moral agency part, and I think that again might be because we're thinking about this differently. Because I would agree that agency doesn't matter when making the claim that it harms an individual. I would agree with that. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's wrong just because it harms. I would just say that, if it harms to a certain degree, and I think this is in the book, where the quality of life argument is needed to come to a conclusion that it's a serious harm. Because if it's just a small harm, then the benefits of coming into existence can outweigh the small harm. And again, that's just saying if while saying that, because you can make the statement it's a harm, but now to what degree is the harm? So just saying it's a harm, I don't think gets you to a antinatalist conclusion, at least within the framing of this particular argument. And that's the distinction I make with including moral agents. And I don't know, I guess I'll have to follow up. I don't know if I'll have time to follow up with Tejas, but maybe I'll ping some people to see why take away the idea of moral agency when making evaluations of moral claims and moral arguments. I don't understand that part. Anyway, let's take a look at Lawrence's video.
Should animals be included in antinatalism? This topic has been hotly debated by antinatalists for years and years and years. And in this video, I want to go over why I think they do belong in antinatalism, what that means, what the implications of it might be, and also what are some of the arguments against that, and why I think those arguments fail. Now, the best place to start is obviously to define what the word animal means. In this video, I'm using animals to mean non-human biological individuals who are sentient. And by that, what I mean is have a subjective experience where they can experience positive and negative states. But the key one I think we'll be looking at is negative states. Now, of course, this isn't the actual taxonomical definition of animal, which I will pop up on screen now, because I don't think the taxonomical definition really gets at the crux of what the argument about animals in antinatalism is about. And that's whether Homo sapiens, one species of animal, should be included in antinatalism, or if the wider group of all sentient beings should be included in antinatalism. And of course, I know some people will be thinking that there are similar ethical issues with creating non-biological sentient beings, although I don't think if it's even possible those are identical, they are similar. So stuff in this video will be relevant to that, but I think that topic is for another video, so I'm going to strictly stick to non-human animals that are sentient in this video. Anyway, I think that is enough of definitions, and I think it's time to get stuck into the video.
No, give me a definition for antinatalism, because I don't know where you're going. Well, maybe he'll go into that later, because again, I don't know where he's going to be arguing from right now. So we'll see.
So before we dive into the actual arguments before and against
nice video. Tejas and Lauren, kudos on the video production. I probably shouldn't have paused it right there. But anyway, yeah, these videos are it looks very polished. So kudos. I'm definitely not there. But maybe in a couple of weeks or I'll figure out how to make more polished content. But for now, it's going to be a very amateurish. All right.
including animals in antinatalism, I think it would be useful to quickly map out a way of how we can actually navigate this question. And to do that, I think we need to start by taking a look at antinatalism itself. So in my current thinking on antinatalism, the best way to me to conceptualize it and talk about it is how Thaddeus Metz described it. Contemporary antinatalism is fascinating and important for requiring sophisticated reflection on the evaluative question of how to judge the worthwhileness of lives and on the normative one of what basic duties entail for the creation of new lives. So here he identifies two parts to antinatalism, an evaluative part and a normative part. So the evaluative part is obviously evaluating something. So in the antinatalist case, that would be evaluating coming into existence. The normative part, on the other hand, is a moral judgment of an action taken that is relevant to the evaluated thing. So in the case of antinatalism, that action is creating a new being. So to make this a bit clearer, let's lay it out and I will put this up on screen. So the evaluative part is coming into existence is a harm. And obviously some people will say sentient existence or just human existence. And the normative part is creating.
So Okay, let him finish what he's saying.
New, either sentient or human life is unethical. And a quick side note, I've actually been told that splitting antinatalism into these two constituent parts has actually been done as well by the German philosopher Oliver Halleck in this book. But to my knowledge, it is only in German at present. So if you speak German, it's great for you. You can check that out. If you can't, then maybe in the future you will be able to access that in a different language. Anyway, moving on. So I think the best place to start is the evaluative part of
Okay, I gotta look at that again.
Screen. So the evaluative part is coming into existence is a harm, and obviously some people will say sentient existence or just human existence. And the normative part is creating new, either sentient or human life is unethical. And a quick side note, I've actually
Okay. Because the first statement is a normative claim. Coming into a human existence is a serious harm. You're making a value statement there, which is where you're saying, like, the normative section here, it is unethical to create sentient life. Yeah, that statement is also a normative claim. But I think that this division might be a little bit complicated, or I'm completely wrong about the way that this is usually categorized. And why does it even have to be categorized this way? Like, I don't even... So from my understanding, moral statements and moral arguments are normative, but not all normative statements are moral claims. They can be they can be, again, like, if we make a normative statement about this picture is beautiful, that's you're making a value statement there from which differentiates from a descriptive claim. You can build normative statements from descriptive claims, and then build moral statements or moral arguments from moral statements, which is a normative stance. So I think I think there might be an issue with that. I'm probably not articulating it clearly. I'll have to think about it a little bit more. Anyway, let's go on.
The normative part is creating new, either sentient or human life is unethical. And a quick side note, I've actually been told that splitting antinatalism into these two constituent parts has actually been done as well by the German philosopher Oliver Halleck in this book. But to my knowledge, it is only in German at present. So if you speak German, it's great for you. You can check that out. If you can't, then maybe in the future you will be able to access that in a different language. Anyway, moving on. So I think the best place to start is the evaluative part of antinatalism, and talking about whether animals should be included in that, or if it should just be reserved for one species, which would be Homo sapiens. So obviously the evaluative part would center around whether existence is a harm to humans alone, or if it's actually a harm to all sentient beings. But to be honest, I actually don't think this is where most of the disagreement is going to be. I might be wrong on this, but I think that most disagreement that people are going to have with each other is on the normative part, about putting moral judgment onto actions when it concerns animals. The normative part of this conversation would be about whether it is unethical to create other animals alongside it being unethical to create other humans. But this part of the conversation actually gets a bit tricky, because there's actually two situations when it comes to creating new non-human animals. It can either be humans that create them, such as the case in, for example, example, farming. Or it could also be that animals are creating each other. So when humans breed other animals into existence, there's a moral agent involved. So it makes sense to talk about that action in moral terms. But animals aren't moral agents themselves. And so when we talk about them bringing each other into existence, it isn't as clear that we can use the same language and make the same judgments. So that makes the situation a bit more complicated, but we'll shelve that topic for now because we'll talk about it later. And I feel like we've now laid out a decent enough path on how we can discuss this issue. And before we actually have that discussion, and we will get to it, I want to just take a detour to talk about why we should have this discussion. Like, why is it worth having in the first place? Why is this an important question as to whether animals...
I'm going to pause this to take a look at something, and I'll see if I can bring it up on my screen. Windows capture. I guess that worked. Okay. I'm assuming that's shown on my screen, like you guys can see that. I gotta check my stream to make sure. One sec. Okay, cool. So here, descriptive versus normative claims, moral claims. Is my microphone on? Yeah. Moral claims are a type of normative claim. For this to be helpful, we need to say something about normative claims. Descriptive versus normative. A claim is a statement that asserts something that could be either true or false. A descriptive claim is a claim that asserts that such and such is the case. A normative claim, on the other hand, is a claim that asserts that such and such ought to be the case. Normative claims make value judgments. Descriptive claims do not make value judgments. So an example of a descriptive claim is the mug of coffee in front of me is now at room temp. I had toast and eggs for breakfast this morning. Kevin is under 6 feet tall. These are descriptive claims. They make no value judgments. And then examples of normative claims. Star Wars, The Force Awakens is a better movie than Star Wars Episode 1. That was a really stupid thing to do. If you wanted to pass the test, you should have studied harder. Your electrocardiogram test results are normal. The state should not have the right to take the life of one of its citizens as punishment for a crime. These are all normative claims. Each one of them express a value judgment of some kind. I think that's what I was trying to get at, is that making the value statement that it is bad would be considered like part of the moral, part of the normative claim. However, only the last one expresses a moral claim. The others express different kinds of non-moral normative values and different kinds of normative judgments. Let's take a closer look at these kinds of normative values so that we have a better idea of what distinguishes moral values and moral claims. Let's look at our first example of normative claim. So this is like an aesthetic claim. Star Wars: The Force Awakens is a better movie than Star Wars Episode 1. Here we're making a statement about the relative quality of two different movies in the Star Wars franchise. We're saying that one movie is better than the other. Better how? Better in what respect? Better in respects that we commonly use to make judgments about the artistic and aesthetic qualities of film. Better acting, better script, better storytelling, better cinematography, better art direction, etc. So, okay. So I think I would be wrong when I'm saying like a piece of art would be considered beautiful, maybe. As long as it's in reference to something or comparative, probably. These are artistic judgments. Well, maybe then that statement would be fine. And they are particular types of class of normative judgment. We make aesthetic judgments when we say that such and such piece of music, film, dance, theater, cartoon, fine art, etc., is good or bad. Oh, okay. High quality or low quality, successful or unsuccessful, and so on. We also make aesthetic judgments when we judge the quality of figure skating performance, judge the quality of wine or food. Oh, I'm not going to read all of this. Anyways, so that's for art. And then for rationality, that's a really stupid thing to do. It's clearly normative in the sense that it's making a value judgment. To say that you've done something stupid is to imply that you should not have done it. And then a function claim. Here's another example of a normative claim that is distinct from aesthetic and rationality claims, but is clearly not a moral claim. Your electrocardiogram test results are normal. An ECG measures electrical activity of your heart. It's used to diagnose chest pains and symptoms of the heart disease and otherwise monitor the health of the heart. To say your ECG results are normal is to make a normative claim. Your heart is functioning the way it should, the way a healthy heart ought to function. All right. Anyway, so, and then, yeah, here's there's legal claims, moral claims. Again, I think there's different types of claims, different types of normative claims, I think is the point that I was trying to get at. And I don't know this, like, I could quickly Google this while looking at Lawrence's video. I don't know how like set this is, but I think that because there's different types of normative claims that there's some confusion or we're kind of talking past each other or making different claims. So I think that this might be one of the issues in play. All right, let's get back to that video.
Are included in antinatalism or not. Well, it's important because it gets to the center of a debate that has been happening for years amongst antinatalists, and that's whether antinatalism is anthropocentric or sentiocentric, and what the implications of those two things would mean for the actions we take. So, for instance, when it comes to advocacy, an anthropocentric antinatalist conclusion may lead to advocacy that resembles something like the voluntary human extinction movement, where they advocate for the voluntary cessation of human breeding and therefore the extinction of the human species. A sentiocentric antinatalist conclusion, on the other hand, in advocacy, may share the same long-term goal of human extinction, but they may sideline that in the short term to pursue a more focused effort on other forms of activism that address non-human animals. So, for example, that could be advocating for a vegan food system. It's also the case that antinatalism doesn't just have implications for our reproductive choices. It also has implications for other aspects of our behavior as well. So, for example, a sentiocentric...
I was kind of zoned out there. Hold on.
Natalist conclusion may lead to advocacy that resembles something like the voluntary human extinction movement, where they advocate for the voluntary cessation of human breeding and therefore the extinction of the human species. A sentiocentric antinatalist conclusion, on the other hand, in advocacy, may share the same long-term goal of human extinction, but they may sideline that in the short term to pursue a more
I think the claim, because it's saying we can share the goal of human extinction. I don't think that's the goal. I think the position is about creating life. You're making a statement about the creation, not the continuation. Now, in practical terms, the continuation will inevitably bring more beings into existence. However, that doesn't necessarily have to mean, that we die out. So I'm not too sure about how he's talking about extinction, because I know some people argue that we have a moral duty to bring about extinction, and I don't think we do. I think as a consequence, and I know Amanda dislikes this or doesn't get where I'm coming from or other people are coming from when we say that as a consequence, or it's entailed that extinction could happen, but we're focused on the ethic of the creation. Like we're making a claim about the problematic nature of creation, not saying that my goal is to extinct everyone. Like that's adding more on top of the antinatalist view that it appears that both Tejas and Lawrence have, or at least claiming about these two distinct sets of claims, the normative and the moral. I'm getting kind of maybe it's because I'm tired, but the evaluative, the normative, and the moral claim. But the thing is, I think they're using the moral claim under normative, and using these two things about making the statement that it's bad to come into existence, and then the other statement, it's morally wrong, or that it's a harm, versus here's an argument with a conclusion that's saying antinatalism is the conclusion. Anyway, I'm nitpicking on the extinction part, but I think that matters because a lot of people ask me about why am I not an extinctionist, and that would require another long video, and I'll just give a quick summary of it. Is that let me put it this way, it would be good if people did not have what's that disease that we have, like buildup of mucus in your lungs and you don't live that long? It's like is it cystic? I think it's like cystic fibrosis. It would be good if that didn't exist, right? This is going to be going back to actually claiming a state of affairs versus what we ought to do. So I could say that given voluntary non-procreation, and if it leads to, which wouldn't happen, like not everyone's going to do this, right? But let's say that hypothetically happened. Everyone's like, you know what? We're not doing this anymore. All right, fine. Then I would say that the claim I'm making is that the creation is the wrong maker, not necessarily acting to bring about the goal of extinction, because that opens up a slippery slope of, well, by what means, right? And the reason I used the cystic fibrosis thing is, well, if we're just going to focus on the outcome and not about the means, then I mean, you could say, well, we can get rid of people that have this, and it's no longer there. I think that would be morally wrong, and I feel like people who argue a view of extinctionism is again like this value statement versus what we ought to do, and I think it hasn't been demonstrated why you ought to do it, just by agreeing that it would be a good thing as an outcome if if there was no suffering, no being suffering in the world, right? So we're agreeing on the value, but we're not agreeing on the means. And that's what I would say about people asking me, why am I not an extinctionist? I think within that whole argument of extinctionism, there's going to be another complicated division. And anyways, let's. That's all I'm going to say for now. I don't know if I just complicated more, or hopefully that clarified my position on it. But let's get back into the animal question before we go into all the other stuff.
Focused effort on other forms of activism that address non-human animals. So, for example, that could be advocating for a vegan food system. It's also the case that antinatalism doesn't just have implications for our reproductive choices. It also has implications for other aspects of our behavior as well. So, for example, a sentiocentric antinatalist may want to divest any of their money and resources from industries that partake in the breeding of non-human animals. So one way they could do this is to personally be vegan. Now, obviously, there are also reasons why an anthropocentric antinatalist would be vegan, but they may not be the exact same reason as sentiocentric antinatalists. And actually, Kurimakama talks about this topic in this article, which I'll link in the description so anyone can go read it if they think they'll find that interesting. So, now we know why it's important. Let's get into the actual discussion now. So first I'm going to go over why I think animals should be included in antinatalism and where I think the boundaries of that are. And then I'm going to go over some objections that I've heard and respond to those. I think the most reasonable place to start is with the evaluative side of antinatalism and trying to cross the species barrier when it comes to the evaluative side. So to begin, I think it would make sense to start where we all...
So moving forward in terms of my commentary, I'm going to use the terms that he's using, because trying to use my framework to do a commentary on his framework is just going to be confusing. So I'm going to use evaluative and normative in the way that he's using it. Okay.
Agree, and that is humans are harmed by being brought into existence. As antinatalists, we all believe in this common foundation to antinatalism, but some people, namely anthropocentric antinatalists, draw the line there and claim that it's only humans, Homo sapiens, one species of animal, that evaluation is true of. But how can that belief be justified, that a human is harmed by their existence, but a puppy born in a puppy mill is not harmed by their existence? Well, to justify such a belief, someone defending it would have...
I think there's a difference between, are they harmed by their existence, or are they harmed by being created into existence? And again, maybe I'm nitpicking here, but it sounds like when you make that specific example of a dog being bred into a puppy mill, yeah, that existence is pretty bad. However, you could breed an animal into a loving home and have a net positive life. Then those two cases would be different. I think the question is comparing existence and non-existence to the creation of the life, and then that goes back to the value asymmetry. So I don't know. Again, maybe I'm nitpicking. Maybe I have nothing. Anyways, we'll see where this goes.
To come up with some morally relevant difference between human existence and non-human animal existence, such that human existence is a harm, but the existence of all other animals is not a harm. So what could this difference be? What could this trait be that this difference in evaluation...
Name the trait. So I would agree that, as an evaluative statement, it's a harm for all animals to be brought into existence. Now, can the harm be justified? What is the degree of harm? Do the benefits outweigh the harm? Those are some other questions that could lead people in different directions, I think.
attribution rests on? Well, I've done my best to try and find people who advocate for this position. I have looked at literature, and I've posted in the Anthropocentric Antinatalism Facebook group to ask their
I want to read this. Hi all, I'm compiling arguments for anthropocentric antinatalism. I want to share them here to make sure I'm not misrepresenting or misunderstanding them. Non-human animals are not moral agents, and so we judge their behavior to be unethical. So it would make no sense to include them in antinatalism. Animals cannot experience existential suffering, or generally as much suffering as humans, and so the suffering they experience is not of a quality relevant to antinatalism. Antinatalism should focus on humans, as those are the beings we can reason with and influence, and so it makes no sense to include animals. Intervening with animals' procreation will likely backfire and increase suffering, so we shouldn't do that. Thus, there's no point including them in antinatalism. Animals can't give consent for us to intervene in their reproductive process, and so we should not include them in antinatalism. Have I got anything wrong? Am I missing any arguments? Thanks. And then the other post said, hey everyone, new to the group, I personally am a sentiocentric antinatalist, but I wanted to understand your position. Why do you all exclude other sentient beings who aren't human from antinatalism? Or maybe another way of putting it is, why do you think they don't qualify? All right. Let's see what they said.
Opinion, and I've come up with a range of traits which we can go through. So first I'm going to present them all, and then I'm going to respond to them all. Now, when I'm presenting these traits, I'm going to put up quotes.
Those sounds are from my chair, by the way. I'm not like farting in the background.
on the screen of different people that have argued for different traits that justify this difference in evaluation. But I'm not saying that those quotes accurately represent those specific people in their entirety, because I'm sure they've said other things elsewhere that may mean that they've changed their opinion or they have a different opinion, but that those quotes accurately represent the argument for that trait that's being put forward. So, trait 1, the fear of death. Humans are consciously aware of the fact that we are going to die, but animals are not. So this trait is basically death anxiety, not just anxiety over the process of dying, but anxiety over just the idea of death itself. In the chapter Additional Remarks on the Doctrine of the Suffering of the World from Arthur Schopenhauer's second volume of This, because I'm not going to attempt to say it, he says the following about the difference in death anxiety between...
What was that?
Idea of death itself. In the chapter Additional Remarks on the Doctrine of the Suffering of the World from Arthur Schopenhauer's second volume of This, because I'm not going to attempt to say
Paraga and Paralipomena. Wow. Okay, yeah,
He says the following about the difference...
I don't think I've heard of that one before. I am not an expert on Schopenhauer. Anyway.
Anxiety over the process of dying, but anxiety over just the idea of death itself. In the chapter Additional Remarks on the Doctrine of the Suffering of the World from Arthur Schopenhauer's second volume of This, because I'm not going to attempt to say it, he says the following about the difference in death anxiety between humans and other animals. But through all of this, the measure of pain in humans grows much more than that of pleasure, and it is greatly magnified, particularly by the fact that death is actually known to them, whereas animals instinctively flee it without actually knowing it and therefore without ever having to focus on it. The second trait is temporal awareness. So humans can accumulate suffering in the past, present, and future, whereas animals only exist and experience the present. So in his interview on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, Julio Cabrera references Arthur Schopenhauer's work by saying that animals lack the awareness, reflection, feeling of past and future, and certainty of death that produces a quality of suffering unique to humans. And to hear from the man himself, Arthur Schopenhauer says again in his chapter Additional Remarks on the Doctrine of the Suffering of the World, a human being has no more in terms forms of real physical pleasure than an animal, except insofar as his more highly magnified nervous system intensifies the sensation of each pleasure, but also each pain. This comes about primarily from the fact that in him everything undergoes a powerful intensification by thinking of the absent and the future. For along with reflection, the animal lacks the condenser of joys and suffering, which therefore cannot pile up as this occurs in humans by means of recollection and foresight. Instead, in animals, the suffering of the present always remains, just as it is the first time. The suffering of the present, even if it recurs innumerable times in succession. So here what I think Arthur Schopenhauer is saying is that we can basically suffer 3 times from the same event. We can think about it in the future, endure it in the present, and remember it in the past, whereas other animals can only suffer in the present. He actually clarifies this more when he says about animals. Animals are the embodied present. The obvious peace of mind they partake of in this manner often shames our frequently restless and dissatisfied state brought about by thoughts and cares. Consciousness is limited to the intuitive and thereby to the present, which is why it experiences an extremely brief fear and hope only in connection with objects that already exist intuitively in the present, whereas human consciousness has a horizon encompassing the whole of life. Trait 3 is existential suffering. So humans have the capacity to existentially suffer, whereas animals don't have the cognitive capacity to experience this. So whilst existential suffering isn't actually mentioned by name, Peter Rachel Zapp's The Last Messiah embodies this point quite well. So in his introduction to the English translation of The Last Messiah, Trine Riel says that the overdeveloped human intellect, which Zapp calls an abomination and an absurdity, an exaggeration of disastrous nature, can in a similar way be seen as the result of a blind and highly unfortunate organic mutation. Unfortunate because it makes life existentially unbearable and categorically unsustainable. So this capacity to suffer existentially through a perceived lack of meaning or purpose is something that certain individuals say separates human existence out from other animals. Other animals can suffer in a range of ways, but humans are unique in that they can understand consciously that their suffering is for no ultimate reason, or they suffer directly from the fact that their life has no ultimate meaning or purpose. As Zapf himself says, the animal too knew angst during thunderstorms and under the lion's claw, but man came to feel angst for life itself. And trait 5 is a lack of sameness. We can't make judgments about the existence of other animals because they're so different from us, we don't understand their existence. So this is a more general point that actually isn't really about a trait, it's just about the fact that we have a lack of understanding. Essentially, animals are too different from us, and so we can't understand their experience of existence. This is actually a point that Thomas Nagel makes in his book A View from Nowhere. In the book, Nagel talks about how he once liberated a spider from a urinal because he concluded that the spider would be miserable and exhausted, and so he thought that he would help the spider escape this situation. But once he helped the spider out of the urinal, the spider actually quickly died. And Nagel uses this anecdote to highlight, as he puts it, the hazard of combining perspectives that are distinct. So I'm actually going to deal with this one straight away and come back to the others after this. So the point that Nagel is making about how one party, no matter how good their intentions are, can harm another party when trying to help them because they may not accurately understand the conditions they're in or their interests. I think this is a valuable point to make, but I think it can only be taken so far. I think sometimes people lean into this observation too much to argue against any attempt to identify sameness between two parties. Taken far enough, this observation could be used to drive a wedge between any two parties that differ in any way. In fact, it could be used to drive a wedge between any two individuals. Someone could make the same point about the differences between men and women, or cognitively impaired people and non-cognitively impaired people, not just spiders and humans. The thing is that despite differences between groups, we can still recognize that we are similar in some anatomical and behavioral ways, such that we should care about others who are different from us in a moral way. And for antinatalists, caring about them in a moral way is recognizing that they'd have been better never coming into existence. And I would say this is the case for non-human animals. The behaviors they exhibit show a clear likeness to us. Behaviors that show feelings like joy, fear, anxiety, loneliness, boredom, and way more. They also have nervous systems similar enough to ours that it's reasonable to assume, and experts have concluded, that they are sentient in ways that matter to us about our own sentience, and that's the capacity to suffer. I think that even if someone is not totally convinced that we understand the experience of existence by animals, I think that even if there's some evidence, we should err on the side of caution and not create them. At the end of the day, no one's harmed by their non-creation. In other words, it's better to not create someone and find out that it would have been fine to create them than to create someone and find out that it was wrong to create them. Anyway, so let's go back to the other traits. So these are the traits that I've seen people claim separate out humans from other animals in the evaluative sense of antinatalism, that existence is a harm to humans, but it's not to other animals.
Many of these traits and others people maintain separate other animals from humans in a morally relevant way are simply factually mistaken. Forgot to include this in the recording. Okay.
Now, it's not going to come as a surprise to you that I disagree with these traits, and there's two main reasons that I disagree with them that we're going to get into. So firstly, to justify a morally relevant difference in evaluation, we need to base that on a morally relevant difference in the two groups that tracks the same line as our moral differentiation in the evaluation. But the thing is, all of these proposed traits fail to do that, and they fail to do it in multiple ways. So the first way is that they don't actually point to a difference between humans and other animals. They point to a difference between a certain group of humans and all other sentient beings, i.e. other humans and other animals. Existential suffering, the fear of death, and temporal awareness all require a certain level of cognitive capacity to be present. And there are many human beings that don't have the sufficient cognitive capacity to experience these things.
So in running down name the trait kind of, I don't know what to call it, evaluation, he's, I think, going to use the marginal cases argument towards trying to debunk all these traits being morally relevant for moral consideration. Especially if you say like, oh, we wouldn't do that to babies, or we wouldn't do that to cognitively impaired people. That's usually the marginal cases argument.
Three examples are a young child, a cognitively impaired person, and an elderly person whose mental faculties have deteriorated. So these groups of people, and maybe more that I haven't thought of, have, as far as we know, the same or lower cognitive capacities than many animals. And so to point to these traits as a justification for a difference in moral evaluation doesn't create a line between humans and other animals. It creates a line between some humans and other humans and all animals. The other way that these traits fail is that the line that they establish is actually porous and individuals can move across it. And the way that people move across the boundary is by moving in and out of the groups that I just described. So for example, a very young child will lack those traits, but as they mature, they will gain them. Another example is a mature adult who has those traits and then sustains some sort of brain injury and loses them. So if someone is going to base their evaluation of coming into existence being a harm on those traits, they're going to have to accept that they don't apply to a lot of humans, and also that people can move in and out of coming into existence having been a harm to them and not having been a harm to them. To me, this seems like very shaky ground on which to base your evaluation. The second reason I reject these traits is because I think they actually all point to one fundamental underlying trait that actually includes animals, and that's the capacity to suffer. Each of these traits point to a specific form of suffering and try to use it as a way to differentiate humans from other animals. But I've never heard anyone actually explain why these specific forms of suffering constitute their sufferer as having been harmed by their coming into existence, given that the other forms of suffering presumably don't, otherwise they wouldn't have singled this one out. They each seem to suggest that this specific form of suffering is the one that makes coming into existence a harm, and the others, whilst they cause suffering whilst you're alive, don't specifically categorize coming into existence as a harm if you experience those forms of suffering once you're here. Why are those forms of suffering worse though? Why is existential suffering worse than the raw physical experience of being stabbed with a knife? There doesn't seem to be any reason given for this, or an obvious one that I can think of. There also seems to be a lack of appreciation for the magnitude of suffering as well. So for example, a human that is born and can existentially suffer, but actually has a pretty good life, and existential suffering only punctuates their existence, is harmed by their coming into existence. But a pig on a factory farm is not harmed from their coming into existence because they can't existentially suffer. The only trait that I can see that is consistent, that actually encompasses all of those other traits and encompasses all humans, is the capacity to suffer. The thing is though, that also encompasses other animals. Even Schopenhauer recognizes this in the piece that I was quoting from before. I can never look at such a dog without heartfelt compassion for it and deep indignation for its master. And with gratification, I think of the case reported a few years ago by the Times of a certain lord who kept a large dog on a chain. Once strolling through his yard, he could not resist the urge to pet the dog, whereupon it immediately tore open his arm from top to bottom, justifiably. It was trying to say, "You are not my master, but my devil, who makes my brief existence into a hell. May this happen to all who keep dogs on a chain." Any being who can have an existence that can be described as hell, I think is safe to say that they were harmed by coming into existence. And maybe we live in different degrees of what Schopenhauer called hell. Each individual, let alone each species, will suffer to a different degree. Someone in great luxury may not suffer as someone living in poverty, but neither of them may suffer as much as a pig on a factory farm. But that doesn't mean that each of them were not seriously harmed by coming into existence. So we've looked at the evaluative side of antinatalism, but what about the normative side? And that's the side that says the being who's coming into existence is evaluated as a harm. It is unethical to create them. I think again, it's easiest to start where we all have common ground. And so that would be that it's unethical to create other humans. And it's interesting, one of the arguments along these lines is Julio Cabrera's moral impediment argument. He argues that humans have what he calls a moral impediment, that humans have a structural impossibility to be moral and not to harm, abuse, and exploit others. So he says that human existence is burdened with this moral disqualification. Not only are we creating new moral agents, but we're creating severely flawed moral agents. Again, in his Exploring Antinatalism interview, what did not work is the human life. The other animals are fine as they are and would be much better off without the sufferings introduced by humans. So that's an argument that makes the normative part of antinatalism stronger for humans alone. But let's get back to whether the normative part of antinatalism can actually apply to other animals at all. So the most obvious place to start is by looking at the breeding of other animals by humans, whether that be on farms or in laboratories or in puppy mills. Now, the evaluative and the normative parts of antinatalism actually focus on different parties in the act of creating new life. The evaluative part...
So I feel like this is going to go down the whole agency talk. So yeah, like my position is, a moral agent. It's only going to be evaluated as morally good or bad, depending if there's a moral agent committing that, making that choice to be able to make the evaluation in the first place. So we'll see where this goes.
Focus is on the being who is created and the fact that they're harmed. The normative part focuses on the party doing the creating, the fact that they've acted unethically. So if for the sake of argument we accept that animals are included in the evaluative side, it seems clear that on the normative side, animals would also be included when it comes to humans breeding them, insofar as the individual who is in focus when it comes to the normative side is still a moral agent, a cognitively competent human.
So before commenting on I think this is like a whole category stuff about whether a category of like what is being defined as antinatalism. Is it the descriptive? Is it the evaluative? Is it the normative? So I think this is why this stuff is happening and these divisions are happening. But what I was going to say is this is the position that I take, what he's saying right now. And in my view, I find this, but I don't know if he's going to go down the road of what Tejas said, that it doesn't matter if there's a moral agent there, it's still going to be a bad thing. if we just step back from that second part, I don't know how people can justify, if you agree with the descriptive that it'll harm a sentient being. Like, first of all, you gotta accept that part. But if you accept that part, then an agent creating either taking the causal action to create new sentient life, be it human or non-human. I don't know how people wouldn't accept that. Again, I think you'd have to argue from marginal cases. You'd have to go through why would you discriminate based on species membership for moral consideration. But if you go beyond, if you get to that point that they are worthy of moral consideration and these are moral subjects, then a moral agent shouldn't create moral subjects. And I think that seems perfectly fine to me. That's currently my position. Open to arguments and counter arguments, of course. So that's where I'm at in my little journey.
And the one who's being created, albeit they've changed species, is still being harmed by their creation. So the two essential features of the normative part of antinatalism remain intact: that there is a moral agent involved in the decision and that the one being created is harmed. The question becomes trickier when we move to animals creating each other, and predominantly we're talking here about wild animals. Whilst animals in the wild and any other animals that breed amongst themselves are still harmed by coming into existence, the ones creating them aren't moral agents. And as this is the case, only one of the two necessary conditions to meet animals being included in the normative part of antinatalism are met. So for this reason, it doesn't make sense to include them in the normative part of antinatalism. And David Benatar has actually commented on this. Whether my argument for antinatalism also applies to wild animals depends in part on what exactly one means by antinatalism. If it is the...
Oh my God. Did I just... Maybe I shouldn't be commenting on these things because, like, I'm just restating what other people are saying right now. So it depends on what exactly we mean by antinatalism. If the view that bringing a sentient being into existence is wrong, then, as you note, antinatalism cannot usually apply to wild animals, given the procreating wild animals are not moral agents. Right? That's my view. There would be exceptions where humans played a role in helping wild animals procreate. Those humans would then do wrong. Yeah, so that seems fine. Yeah, that seems okay. I think we're all on the same page here. So we'll see where this goes.
View that bringing a sentient being into existence is wrong, then antinatalism cannot usually apply to wild animals, given that procreating wild animals are not moral agents. There would be exceptions where humans played a role in helping wild animals to procreate. Those humans would then do wrong. However, if the term antinatalism is understood as the view that coming into existence has negative value, then antinatalism could also apply to wild animals. If that's the case, then while we cannot blame wild animals for procreating, we could say that it would be better if they did not procreate. We might even say that such procreation is pro tanto prevent-worthy, assuming that there are not sufficiently strong countervailing considerations not to interfere. So before we get on to any...
So, now we're getting, again, back to what are we defining as antinatalism. And to go back to Steve's article, he's making the case that to be classified antinatalist, it should not have non-antinatalist. I would say, I don't want to restate his position, but he says non-antinatalist normative claims or statements. So that's what he's putting forth. I mean, that could be the case if we're agreeing that's the case, but I think this hasn't. I don't think it's been settled. I as just a matter of fact, we have two groups of people within the antinatalist circle. One saying that claiming that being created or bringing into existence is a harm is antinatalism. And then the other is saying, well, you have to have a moral agent to be even responsible to make the claim that it is right or wrong. And that moral argument or that moral claim is antinatalism. What's the right answer? I mean, I take the first view. These two views exist. They are what they are. I think the first one's correct.
Anything else here? It's actually interesting that Benatar actually kind of also hints at this way of breaking antinatalism down into two constituent parts.
Sorry, and by correct, I meant that's the position that I hold. I don't. Again, it's contingent on the fact of like, what is our definition? If someone like, I think these two views exist. I don't know how to say that this one is or isn't antinatalism, because again, if we're saying antinatalism is just saying that it's harm, then yeah, I mean it is that's what it'll be. But I don't know, like I don't know how to argue. I don't know what the counter argument to that is. This is just a statement of what we as a group or what we as a person making an argument or making a statement defines antinatalism. And maybe it doesn't have to be an objective definition. Just if you're going to talk about antinatalism, just define it the way that you're defining it, and then someone can say, well, I don't define it that way, and then you know where you're disagreeing. Yeah.
Namely the normative and the evaluative parts. But anyway, at the end of his quote, Benatar talks about how, whilst we might not be able to morally condemn animals for breeding amongst themselves, we can recognize that there's a significant amount of harm being done. And given the harm being done in the evaluative sense of antinatalism, we may actually have sufficient reason to intervene to prevent the harm being done in this unfortunate situation. Intervening to prevent sentient beings from coming into existence is not the same as not creating them. And as Benatar says, while preventing wild animals from bringing each other into existence falls outside the scope of antinatalism, we may have sufficient reason to go beyond antinatalism and help alleviate the unfortunate situation that wild animals find themselves in. And in this section, I'll be explaining the thought process behind that desire to go beyond antinatalism. But before I do that, I actually want to point out that it's actually very common for antinatalists to want to organize around an ethical issue that isn't strictly part of antinatalism. Both abortion and the right to die are ethical topics that antinatalists often talk about and often organize around because of the clear links with antinatalism, even though they aren't technically part of antinatalism. And I believe the case of wild animals bringing each other into existence is a similar ethical issue. So let's get stuck into it. So in his essay, The Speciesism of Leaving Nature Alone and the Theoretical Case for Wildlife Antinatalism, Magnus Vinding makes the case that not intervening in nature and leaving wild animals to procreate amongst themselves is actually a speciesist position. And just for anyone that hasn't heard the term before, speciesism is simply the act of discriminating against an individual based on what species they belong to. And speciesism is something that should be rejected alongside racism and sexism. So Magnus starts by actually talking about how people generally tend to agree that we should help other people who fall foul of natural ills like disasters, starvation, disease, and even predator attacks. And that we should do this even when we're frustrating the interests of another party who may be doing the harm. In fact, he states that in many cases it would be cruel not to intervene, like in the case of smallpox, where if we had the capacity to eradicate it, but we chose not to, this would be a cruel thing to do. However, when it comes to non-human animals, it's very common for people to take almost the opposite approach when non-human animals fall foul of the same natural ills. And the stark difference...
Okay, so this is definitely outside the scope of antinatalism. And... oh boy. So this is where I think I understand the concerns. of people including animals into this view, because now we're going down a path of intervening where I don't know what some of the tactics are. Are we going to, and I've seen some vegans argue for this, that we're going to kill predators so that the prey cannot be harmed. And when you're asking, if you use the name, if you're going to like try and do that name the trait thing, why would you treat it differently? I think, I don't know in a counter argument to that, so I would bite a bullet, but I think that there's something problematic about intervening in nature to that degree. I think that there's some interventions that could be made, but again, this isn't the scope of antinatalism. But I can understand if someone says, well, antinatalism is just the assessment that being created into existence is a harm. Therefore, we can do all these other things that are outside of the scope of usually of antinatalism, and like this can go into so many potentially dangerous areas by saying, well, if the goal is to prevent a being from being created into existence, and that's a good thing, then what's on the table and what's not on the table, and then that's going to depend on the person's values and what normative theory of ethics that they subscribe to, and it's just a whole thing. Now, I'm not an activist. Well, I mean, I used to be an activist for animal ethics and stuff like that. But in terms of antinatalism, some people have classified me as an antinatalist. An activist. I was never comfortable with that. I think it's a byproduct of what I do. My whole shtick is just to have conversations, to come to a place of understanding, and to share that knowledge. And as a byproduct, some people become an antinatalist because of it. But that's not my goal. Like, I'm not out there saying to people, you should do this. You like, the world needs more of that. If you want to be an advocate, if you want to be an activist, so be it. That's your own prerogative. I've done that for other causes. I'm burnt out from it. And right now, I'm just interested in trying to understand, and the closest thing for me in terms of activism is who I'm voting for and what are and living in accordance to what I consider a virtuous or an ethical life as best as I can. But I'm not. I'm interested in understanding how people think and how they come to their conclusions. And it just, for the past couple of years, it just happens that when I talk about, say, animal ethics or antinatalism, some people are like, hey, you know what? I'm convinced by this. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, okay. And then so other people will classify me as that. Anyway, so long story short, if you are an advocate and an activist, I think that opening the door to these types of actions is potentially problematic, because I feel like in terms of intervening in nature and going vegan or whatever, you kind of piggybacked off of antinatalism to just argue for the causes that you already believe in. And I don't know why, because antinatalism is a fringe philosophy that's usually people don't accept this. So it's not a useful tactic. But if you're just like trying to be consistent, and say, hey, well, this is a harm, and therefore we should be going vegan, we should be intervening in nature, and that is the most effective thing to do from an antinatalist perspective, then, I mean, again, how are we defining antinatalism? If it's just saying, yeah, it's a harm, then fine, that's where it'll go. But I think in terms of like a movement, it just got kind of overshadowed by, like, in my opinion, this whole thing started with procreative ethics. And now we're going into prevention of other sentient beings being brought into existence, insofar that you could actually justify bringing more, again, that ecological niche argument where the more a certain type of animal that doesn't suffer as much can be justified to create them to reduce suffering of wild animals. And what's even dangerous is we haven't even talked about the philosophy of death. I've come across multiple people who have an Epicurean view of the badness of death. And if you hold that position, then that opens the door to a potentially pro-mortalist position. And then it's a hot mess. So in terms of like keeping things in the straight and narrow without going down the pro-mortalist route, without going into the intervening in wild animals route, and like, again, if I was in the mindset of, hey, I'm an antinatalist, I want to be able to talk to other people about their procreative choices, then I would take the second position, or if now I forget if it was the first or second one, of saying that this is morally wrong, not just saying that antinatalism is the claim that being brought into existence is a harm. I think this is like a strategy thing. It's a tactics thing. And I'm sorry for saying piggybacking off it like that sort of implies that there's some type of maliciousness going on, and I'm not implying that. I think that it can be an unintended consequence of taking the other view, where, okay, well, if I make the claim that it's a harm, then go vegan and intervene in wild animal suffering and prevent artificial sentience from being created, and I don't know, goes down. I can't think of other things, but I'm sure there's a whole host of things that it could entail. And I mean, the split's already happened. This has already happened. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I think I understand other people's concerns about this leap, because they started off solely focusing on making the claim that it's wrong to create. And now we're in the territory of intervening in different areas. That's not talking about just that individual evaluation of creation. I don't know. Well, I mean, it's done, and people are arguing for this. So, like, I don't know. I guess I'm not trying to say one is better than the other. I understand the concern. And I think that if the term is that it's just a harm, then it follows. But if it's not, then it doesn't follow. And I don't know. I don't know how we're going to define that or settle on that.
Different in people's approach to the same issue but with a human and a non-human victim is really highlighted by the fact that in the case of non-human animals in the wild, the conditions are just so much worse. Now, if you want to learn about the lives of wild animals and the variety of harms they face, because that is not really the topic of this video, I would recommend checking out Animal Ethics video course and the website Wild Animal Suffering, and I've linked both of those in the description. But what about when we're specifically talking about the intervention of preventing procreation? Well, Magnus argues that the badness of the lives of wild animals actually provides an overwhelmingly strong justification to make this intervention. He says the reason one need not argue for radical positions on procreation in order to make the case for wildlife antinatalism is, in a nutshell, that life in nature is for the most part extremely bad. In fact, it is so bad that even the most conservative position on human procreation would, if applied without speciesist compromise to the circumstances of non-human beings in nature, recommend wildlife antinatalism, at least for the vast majority of beings. To illustrate this, he uses the survival rates of infant lions. So in lions, 1 in 8 male cubs survives until adulthood. The rest generally tend to die of starvation, illness, or violence. Would these circumstances of male infanticide be permissible in the human context? It seems reasonable to say that most people would say that procreation wouldn't be permissible in these circumstances. And the thing is that male lion cubs aren't even representative of most animals. Fish would be a more representative example. Magnus talks about the female chinook fish, which usually lays around 5,000 eggs. Over half of these eggs hatch as small younglings called alevins, and out of these thousands of young fish, only about 20 will reach adulthood. That's a survival rate of less than 1 in 100. Again, who would find this morally acceptable in the human context? And even if we focus on the ones that survive into adulthood, their quality of life, or lack of quality of life, would also make a similarly strong case. So if we wouldn't accept these conditions for humans, which I don't think anyone would, then accepting them for non-human animals seems to be simple speciesism. Now, Magnus here is making a theoretical case, not a practical one. There has been research done into how contraception can improve the lives of wild animals who already exist and will exist in the future and prevent many from coming into existence. I will link a bunch.
Just a quick thing. If the moral trait is being a moral agent, then it's not determined based on species membership. There could be a species with moral agency, and then that would be determined that they would be responsible for that moral choice, and you could say that that would be wrong. So I don't know if like saying that just because they have another species, it's speciesism. I think like the trait is, are they moral agents? And I don't know if it's been argued why we're making the distinction about whether or not something's moral or not, regardless of moral agency. I could understand making the claim that it's a harm, but then how do you go from it's a harm to we ought to intervene? I think I'm going to pronounce this wrong. It's supererogatory. It would be good if we did it, but it doesn't mean that it's obligated that we do it. And there could be some utility in, trying to reduce like disease in in some animal populations. So you're not inflicting harm or spreading harm to other beings or yourself, or your own species. So there's some utility there. But this would be just like a morally good thing, but it wouldn't be a morally obligatory thing that we ought to do. It would just be good if you did it. I think that's the way I'm seeing it for now. But I might change my view on that, but that's my initial thoughts right now.
that in the description so you can check it out. And if anyone knows of any more research that's been done that I haven't included, please send it to me and I'll include it as well. So now I'm going to respond to some common objections people put forward to going beyond antinatalism in this way. Argument 1. We should focus on human procreation because humans are the ones that we can reason with. This argument assumes that appealing to someone's sense of reason is the way that we should determine who we want to influence. The thing is, we manipulate the behavior of others all the time in completely reasonable ways and not via appealing to their sense of reason, often because they don't have a sense of reason or that it's very limited. We do this with children, we do this with cognitively impaired people, and we also do it with other animals. If one child is hurting another child in the playground, we don't appeal to their sense of reason, we physically shut the situation down, and if we are going to appeal to their sense of reason at all, we do it after the fact. So it doesn't seem clear to me why appealing to a sense of reason is the thing that we should be defining our actions by, especially when the individuals we're talking about don't have a sense of reason. Argument 2. Intervening to help wild animals could actually backfire and so result in more harm.
Oh, so that's a side note. WildAnimalSuffering.org also has a response to common objections like this. This one included. Link in description. It's not our responsibility. Some people argue that we are not responsible for the suffering of wild animals because we did not cause it. Well, I mean, a lot of the suffering was because of us, so I can understand. However, the reason to help animals is because they need our help. If we believe that it is a moral responsibility to help the most vulnerable members of society, regardless of whether or not we caused their suffering, then we should extend that same compassion to wild animals as well. I can see that. I can see an argument for why it would be, again, good to intervene. And I guess they're saying that the duty or the odd is justified by arguing marginal cases, which I've done. I've had this discussion before, and it's kind of yeah, if as he said in the first example there, of like kids about to harm another kid. There are two moral subjects, but you as a moral agent would intervene. That does go into what are we... So, like, we wouldn't say that the moral subject is responsible, but we're talking about the agent in this context, right? And the impetus for the agent to do something. So allowing harm or preventing harm in this context. Anyway, I can see the argument. The case of the child, it's like, well, yeah, we are responsible for our children, but if I even saw two other kids about to harm each other, I would still intervene anyway, even if they're not mine. So why would I not intervene when I see two non-human animals about to well, see, this goes this goes into the predator conversation. So do we actively prevent predators from harming other animals? That goes down a weird path that maybe this follows. And again, now, like, I understand the concern of people like trying to open the doors to this, because are we going to say not only do we intervene in wild animal suffering to prevent their births? How? I don't know. I don't know what the solutions are being argued for. But are we saying that we have a moral obligation to take away predators? Because if you did that with two humans that are moral subjects, you would prevent that being that's killing, that's going around killing children, right? You would either lock them up or like try and remove them from society. So I'm not too sure what Lawrence's answer is on that. Anyway, this is just some of the issues that I can see that would come up.
Peter Singer has actually made this argument before in his book Animal Liberation. Judging by our past record, any attempt to change ecological systems on a large scale is going to do far more harm than good. We cannot and should not try to police all of nature. It is true that attempting to help someone can backfire and cause more harm than good. But there are a variety of ways that humans can help wild animals, and not all of them carry the same implications or risk of harm. So to dismiss intervening on the grounds that it could backfire really doesn't appreciate the nuance of the different risk profiles of different actions that we can take. But also more generally, I don't think the fact that something comes with a risk means that we shouldn't take it if there are other things to take into consideration. One consideration is that the conditions that wild animals are in now is very, very bad. And so not taking action just maintains the current situation. The risks associated with intervening in nature, I think, are an argument for intervening in a considered way, not an argument for non-action. Argument 3, animals cannot consent to interventions that would prevent their breeding. So it is true that some interventions, although not all of them, would impact wild animals in such a way that you would want to get their consent if you could. But unfortunately, it isn't always possible to get their consent. Sometimes when someone is about to be harmed or do harm to a sufficient degree, we intervene to prevent that without stopping to get their consent. I actually think a lot of people would condone this form of intervention in the human context if it were actually a similar case. And Magnus observes, we would usually not need to do anything by force in the human case. Most compassionate parents would be able to understand that they should not have a child if their child would face a 7 in 8 risk of dying an excruciating death before reaching adulthood, much less if the risk is 99 in 100 or worse. No force would be needed provided the parents are minimally compassionate. But in the circumstances where humans are in the same situation that the wild animals are we're talking about, Magnus says this. So in order to make this an accurate analogy, the human parents in question would have to live in circumstances or have some genetic condition that would mean that their children would face extraordinarily bad chances of reaching adulthood, such as a 1 in 100 chance. And it would have to be impossible to convince these parents to use birth control. Should we not intervene in that hypothetical case? Anyone who says no is, I maintain, guilty of not taking seriously the victims whom these parents are sure to create. Argument 4. Humans shouldn't be imposing their morality on other species. So this could mean two things. It could either mean that we can't judge animals by our standards, or it could mean that we shouldn't be controlling animals to fit with our sense of morality, which interventions would be doing. So I've already covered the first part in an earlier part of the video where I talk about how animals are not moral agents, and so it doesn't make sense to judge them by our moral standards. But for the second one, I don't see why we would not influence or control the behavior of animals where appropriate to prevent harm. We do this all the time with humans. So for example, with children, we just create them and then force them into a society that already has pre-established moral norms and force them in most cases to abide by those moral norms. Now, of course, there's healthy debate to be had about what the moral norms should be, but by and large, we consistently force children who are unconsenting participants to adhere to our moral norms. To not do this with animals would be speciesist, because the reason we do it is, in the vast majority of cases, because the victims of the harm are animals themselves. So, in conclusion, animals are indeed included in antinatalism, but only to an extent. I think the most sensible position to take on this is a sentiocentric one, where we recognize that all sentient beings are harmed by their coming into existence, but that we can only judge the moral agents among them for the creation of those sentient beings. We should also recognize that...
I gotta replay that last part, but I think a caveat has to be made there, or like I don't know. What Benatar said in that statement was, it depends, like to make the claim that antinatalism includes animals, it depends what you mean by antinatalism. And if there's two different views of what antinatalism is, then one view can include it, but what if the person argues for the second view? Then it doesn't necessarily entail non-human animals. So Lawrence is making the case for the view that antinatalism is a harm to be created into existence. So, I mean, if that's what people are going to work on for the definition, then yeah, I guess animals are definitely harmed when like being brought into existence. So if again, I think this is just like a category issue or a category discussion or a definition discussion. And I don't see a clear path. I see concerns of just saying, hey, this is a serious harm, and that's antinatalism. I think the view that it is wrong to create life, create sentient life, is my preferred way of looking at things. But I don't know. It is what it is.
Along with the animals that are excluded from the normative part of antinatalism, there are also many humans that are excluded from the normative part of antinatalism, and that we should go beyond antinatalism to help those that are brought into this predicament out of no fault of their own. Let me know if you think animals should be included in antinatalism and what you thought of my arguments for including animals in antinatalism, and I'll see you in the next one.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to leave that up there. In summary, this was a long live stream. I don't even know if any of this went through. I don't even know if this worked. I am definitely not going to keep this video up for long. I'll keep it up in case in case anybody's curious about some of my thoughts, because some people have asked for my thoughts, and I've communicated them in Discord, I've communicated them on Facebook, I've communicated them through text, but I wanted to test out the streaming, make sure my setup is fine, and so far it's fine. I don't have overlays set up, so I don't even remember how I did that before. It's going to be a learning curve. And anyways, I hope this worked. I hope all the settings are okay and it's streaming okay and the sound is okay. I will be reviewing and reacting to a lot of videos in the next few weeks, and I'm going to be doing it through live stream because it helps the channel. It helps because this is being streamed on Twitch as well. So I'd like to, get those services up and running again, and I'll be attempting to make much more professional or polished content than just this test stream here. But in summary about like Steve's article, Tejas's arguments, and then Lawrence's arguments. And again, what Benatar said, I think perfectly encapsulated the issue. It depends what we mean by antinatalism. Are we saying it in the normative sense, or are we saying it in a because the thing is, moral claims are normative. So here's a mix-up that I think is happening too, is that what kind or what type of normative claim, what type of normative statement are we saying is antinatalist? And if we're saying it's a harm, that's antinatalism, or if we're saying it's morally wrong, that's antinatalism. It depends on how you're defining it. I have no idea how to say my version is the right way, yours isn't. It's up to the person to define what they mean and then go on from there for whatever conclusion they're going to argue for. Now, if you're going to argue for the positions or the interventions that Lawrence communicated here, then it does follow from the start of it is a harm that for human and non-human animals to come into existence. Then yeah, some of this stuff does follow, or I could see it. I could see some of it following. I don't know the nuance of it yet. But I don't think, again, then there's the other part that's saying, well, no, it's not just saying that. So anyway, I think this is a category discussion. It's a definition discussion. And if we're going to assert, or if that you cannot make a normative antinatalist statement if it's entailed, or if it has the possibility of having non-antinatalist consequences, I think that needs to be shown, or that needs to be demonstrated, because I don't know if people agree with that, or if that's going to be a standard definition. Again, on the face of it, I think it's obvious that, yeah, like, if these statements sound antinatalist, but then it has an non-antinatalist outcome or conclusion, then I wouldn't, like, personally for me, I wouldn't classify that as antinatalism. I may have done that in the past. I think there was a time I said it's just the position. Life is just creating is a net negative, or sorry, it's a negative value. I think it goes beyond that. I think you're making a moral or an ethical evaluation, not just a statement of, not like a value judgment. So this will be interesting to see how this plays out. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know where the conversation is going to go. And I don't know anybody else making arguments or counter arguments, but these are my thoughts. I don't know anything else to say. I think another thing to be concerned about when you use marginal cases to cross the species barrier is, why don't we adopt animals in the wild? Like, if you would do that for a human, a feral, like let's say a human child was feral, you take them in, you shelter them. Well, then do we have a moral obligation to shelter all animals, or as many as we can, is because we would do that for a human? And I don't know, it opens the door for a lot of things if we say that they're exactly equivalent to children, at least morally. So I don't know the answer to that. Maybe the answer is yes, but it would be something to consider. And again, my position is I could see the arguments for antinatalism, at least with the asymmetry, would include animals, but not all arguments are sentiocentric. So that's it. And I'm going to go do some work now. I will see everybody on another live stream. I'm going to go through the weekly updates. I'm going to do a whole year's worth of catching up, because a lot's happened and I'm behind. So it's time to catch up. It's good to see everybody again. I'm on multiple Discords. I'm on Twitter, X. I'm like, hit me up if ever anybody wants to have a discussion about this. It's probably easier to just voice chat. And I would like to hash it out through voice chat with someone if anybody's willing to like have this discussion. Because I'd like to, hash out some of my views too. All right. Have a good day, everyone. Cheers.